Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
I'm ready.
You know, I love when a listener sends in source material, and today's is all about Apache culture.
Sounds interesting.
Super interesting. The listener sent in The Warrior's Way, Book 8 by Oliver,
Huh?
Shadowhawk Stone,
Okay.
and a few excerpts too, focusing on Apache history, their social structure, storytelling traditions, and get this, how their culture exists in the modern world.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there.
Oh, tons. I think we're going to uncover how Apaches have adapted and thrived over time, and maybe even find some surprising connections to American culture in general.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's start with the basics.
Sure. Where does Apache history even begin? Like, where do they come from?
Well, research shows that they migrated to the southwestern U.S. from the north sometime around the 13th century.
Wow, so that's what, centuries before European contact?
Exactly. Imagine them navigating all those different landscapes, from deserts to
Talk
mountains.
about adaptability.
Yeah.
But what was their lifestyle like back then?
Initially, they were nomadic, relying on hunting and gathering, but later incorporated agriculture.
Interesting. So they really were masters of adapting to all sorts of environments.
Absolutely. Their resilience is remarkable.
And speaking of resilience, they faced some incredibly difficult times, especially with colonization and being forced onto reservations.
Absolutely. The Apache Wars in the late 19th century, with leaders like Geronimo, were a defining moment for them.
Yeah, a really tough period. Well,
Yeah.
what's incredible is that even after all that, they didn't just survive, they thrived.
Exactly. They embraced education, revitalized their culture, and became super active in movements for, land rights and sovereignty.
Wow, it really speaks to their strength and determination.
It does. And it brings us to a theme we see throughout their history adaptation.
Definitely. And speaking of adaptation, that leads us perfectly into storytelling, right?
Yes.
Because I remember the listeners' excerpts highlighted storytelling as super important in Apache culture.
It's central.
But it's way more than just entertainment, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. It's how they educate, preserve their history, and strengthen those social ties. Imagine elders gathering around a fire, sharing their tales.
Yeah.
It's not just about listening, it's about absorbing all that wisdom and experience.
It's like a living, breathing history lesson.
Yeah.
And given that they didn't traditionally write their history down, those oral traditions become even more vital.
Absolutely. Those stories are like living entities. They hold the community's values and teachings.
Right. I remember one example from the excerpts, the tale of Nina and her grandmother.
Yes.
It really showed how those stories create this sense of belonging and continuity for young Apaches.
Such a powerful example. And it makes you think about the impact of things like colonialism and U.S. policies on their lives.
Yeah, what kind of challenges did they face?
Well, forced relocation really disrupted their way of life. Many of their cultural practices were suppressed. It's a complicated and painful part of their history.
No doubt. It makes their resilience all the more remarkable. So, ready to explore another fascinating piece of Apache culture, their songs.
Always.
From what I gathered, their songs aren't just melodies, they're like living narratives. They connect the past and present, the individual and community, even the spiritual realm.
That's a great way to put it. And the variety is incredible.
Okay, tell me more about this variety.
Well, you have ceremonial songs used in rituals to connect with their spirituality and their ancestors.
I see.
Then there are the social songs, the celebratory ones you hear at gatherings and dances.
Oh, I bet those are lively.
Very lively, and often feature call and response patterns.
Fine.
Then you have healing songs, crafted by healers and passed down through generations with those soothing melodies and repetitive structures.
Ah,
And of course, we can't forget the storytelling songs, recounting historical events, legends, moral lessons, a bit like the tales of the trickster coyote.
oh yeah. Those sound amazing.
And then, well, I guess you could say every culture has them, the work songs.
Of course. To help with, well, work.
Exactly. Used to synchronize efforts during tasks, boost morale. And they often feature, you guessed it, call and response patterns.
I should have guessed that. But what I find so fascinating is that Apache music is still thriving today.
Absolutely.
It's been adapted to modern contexts while keeping its cultural meaning.
Exactly. And you see contemporary Apache musicians blending those traditional elements into their work, reaching new audiences and keeping the culture relevant.
It's like tradition meets innovation.
Yeah.
And speaking of keeping things alive, let's not forget their dances. I'm imagining these really elaborate ceremonies.
You're on the right track. Ceremonial dances are a powerful way they express their spirituality, community, and identity.
Right.
Each dance has a sacred, ritualistic purpose.
Mhm.
Like the sunrise dance, a 4-day coming-of-age ceremony for girls, it marks their transition to womanhood.
4 days. That
Yeah,
must be a really powerful
it
experience.
is. And then there's the war dance, this incredible display of strength and unity traditionally performed before battle. It's meant to invoke spirits for guidance and protection.
I can only imagine the energy in that one. It makes you realize that even seemingly simple actions can have such deep cultural meaning.
Exactly. And that realization takes us to how Apache culture exists in today's world.
Right. Because how does a culture with such deep roots navigate the 21st century?
That's the question, isn't it? It's all about balance. Actively working to preserve their heritage while adapting to the realities of the 21st century.
I bet there's some really inspiring examples of that.
Tons. There are language revitalization programs crucial for connecting younger generations to their roots.
Makes sense.
Then there are all sorts of cultural workshops and festivals showcasing traditional crafts, storytelling, dances, things like the Apache powwow.
Right. They're almost like bridges between cultures.
Exactly. And then there's the role of modern media, like the contemporary musicians we talked about. That's a perfect example of tradition blending with the modern world.
Okay, I'm feeling inspired. But let's not forget the influence of Apache culture on, well, American society in general.
A great point. It's woven into the American narrative, even if it's not always acknowledged.
Can you give me some specific examples?
Think about their art.
Um,
It's inspired countless contemporary artists and designers and contributed to this resurgence of interest we're seeing in indigenous art forms.
yeah, their art is so unique and vibrant. I can definitely see the influence.
And then there's their contributions to military history. Their resistance strategies during those Apache wars were super effective.
That's true.
And then in World War II, you had the Apache code talkers. They used their native language to create unbreakable codes.
Wow, I didn't know that.
It's amazing. Their language skills actually helped shape the war's outcome. It shows how valuable indigenous languages are, not just for cultural preservation, but for, well, practical applications.
Definitely. So, after all this incredible information, what's the big takeaway?
Well, the Apache story is one of incredible resilience and adaptability. They've met some intense challenges head-on, but still managed to preserve their identity while navigating a complex world.
It really shows that cultural preservation is an ongoing journey, not a destination.
Precisely. And before we jump into our next section, I'll leave you with a thought. Considering how deeply connected Apache culture is to nature, what can we learn from them about fostering a more sustainable, respectful relationship with the environment?
Hmm, that's a great question to ponder. It really is. It makes you think, doesn't it? But before we get too philosophical, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century.
Yeah.
I imagine that was a huge turning point for the Apache.
Absolutely. Spanish colonization brought new technologies, animals, and trade goods, but it also led to violence and displacement.
It's like progress and disruption all happening at once.
Exactly. And the Apache, they resisted those encroachments fiercely, which eventually led to those Apache wars we talked about.
Right, right. So before all that happened, how did their society actually function? I'm curious about their social structure.
Well, traditionally, they were semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers relying on the resources of their environments. Their social organization was largely based on clans, with really strong kinship ties.
So clans like extended family groups.
Exactly. And those kinship ties were essential to their whole way of life, which was very communal. They lived in smaller bands, each led by a chief who made decisions based on, well, consensus and what was best for the group.
So a very community-oriented way of life.
Very much so. And even today, that sense of community remains strong. They've managed to preserve many of their cultural practices.
Like what?
Things like weaving, beadwork, and of course, their storytelling traditions.
Right. Speaking of those crafts, I read that they're not just decorative, they serve practical purposes too.
Absolutely. Apache women are known for their incredible basket weaving. They're used for all sorts of things, both practical and ceremonial.
Wow.
They're crafted from local materials and often have designs that hold, cultural significance. And what's really fascinating is that many Apache artisans still create these beautiful works today.
That's amazing. It's like they're keeping those traditions alive and, well, supporting their families at the same time. A real blend of heritage and livelihood.
Exactly. And let's not forget about all their cultural events and ceremonies. Powwows, Seasonal festivals, healing ceremonies, they're all so important to Apache life.
I bet.
They provide spaces for cultural expression, for connecting across generations, for, well, spiritual well-being.
It sounds like a culture that truly values its traditions and its people.
Absolutely. And they've also been active in political and social advocacy. They've established organizations to protect their rights and, preserve their heritage.
Like what kinds of things?
They're involved in land reclamation efforts, cultural education programs, and legal battles to protect their ancestral lands and resources.
Wow, that's inspiring. It's like they're fighting for their future while honoring their past.
Precisely. They're a true testament to resilience and adaptability, navigating all the complexities of the modern world while honoring their legacy. You mentioned earlier their geographical
I
diversity.
did.
I'm curious, how did living in such different regions shape the Apache people?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Geography played a huge role in their lifestyles and cultural practices.
I can imagine.
Take the Western Apache, for instance. They live in the mountainous areas of east central Arizona.
Yeah.
Their environment really influenced their hunting and gathering practices. It led them to adopt seasonal migrations to take advantage of, well, different ecological zones.
So they had to be flexible to survive.
Exactly. Then you have the Chiricahua Apache, known for their incredible skills on horseback.
Right.
They lived in southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. They adapted to a more nomadic way of life.
I see.
Being able to travel long distances on horseback, well, that allowed them to pursue game and resources across a much wider area.
So their environment directly shaped their way of life?
Absolutely. And those adaptations are reflected in everything, from their dances to their storytelling. It's incredible how geography and culture are so intertwined.
Yeah, I'm starting to get the bigger picture. Their history isn't just about battles. It's about adaptation, resilience, and a deep connection to the land.
Precisely. And it's a story that's still unfolding as they navigate the complexities of today's world while preserving their unique identity. So I think we've laid a good foundation for understanding Apache history and social structures, but there's one element we haven't really explored yet that I find particularly fascinating:
What's that?
the role of spirituality and beliefs in their culture.
Oh, right. You mentioned before that they see the natural world as having spiritual significance.
Exactly. For them, mountains, rivers, plants, animals, they're all seen as living entities, each with its own spirit. It's a very holistic worldview, one that emphasizes respect for all forms of life.
So it's not just about worshiping deities, it's about recognizing the interconnectedness of everything.
You got it. And this idea of interconnectedness shapes their understanding of health and well-being, too.
How so?
Well, they believe that health is about achieving balance between the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of a person. When one of those is out of balance, it affects everything else.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do they go about maintaining that balance?
Through rituals and ceremonies. They're not just religious events. They're woven into their daily lives.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. The sunrise ceremony, which we touched on earlier, is a great one. It's not just about a girl becoming a woman. It's about connecting with spiritual forces, asking for guidance and protection.
Right, right. And I remember you mentioning the blessing way ceremony too.
Exactly. That one's all about restoring balance and harmony. It's usually performed when someone's dealing with things like illness, trauma, or major life changes.
So it's like seeking help and support from the spiritual realm.
Yes, and it also reinforces those communal bonds. They're often performed in groups, bringing people together to support each other and connect with their shared beliefs.
It's like a spiritual support system.
Yeah.
And speaking of support systems, it seems like storytelling plays a big role in transmitting their spiritual teachings too.
Absolutely. Elders share these stories filled with wisdom and moral lessons, passing those beliefs down to younger generations. And these stories aren't just entertainment. They're about understanding the world and one's place in it.
I love how their spiritual beliefs are so integrated into their everyday lives. It's not just something they practice on special occasions, it's part of who they are.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it's this deep-rooted spirituality that's helped them face all those historical challenges and adapt to the modern world without losing their unique identity.
So despite all the pressures of modern society, their spirituality remains a source of strength.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that even in a world that's constantly changing, those ancient traditions can still provide meaning and guidance. Speaking of the modern world, we're getting close to the end of our deep dive, but I'd love to touch on one last thing:
Okay, what's that?
the future of Apache cultural heritage.
Ah, yes. That's the big question, isn't it? What does the future hold?
It is. And it's something the Apache are actively thinking about and working on. They're definitely facing some challenges, but they're also incredibly proactive and resourceful.
So what are some of the biggest obstacles they're up against?
Well, one of the most pressing is the ongoing pressure of assimilation.
Assimilation.
Meaning being absorbed into the dominant culture. It's a challenge for many indigenous groups, and the Apache are no exception.
Right.
It can lead to, the erosion of traditional languages, beliefs, and practices. And for a culture so deeply rooted in its heritage, that's a serious threat.
I can see how that would be a constant struggle, trying to hold on to your unique identity in a world that's always pushing for conformity.
It is. And then there's the issue of language loss, which is a major concern for the Apache.
You mentioned language revitalization efforts earlier.
Right. Apache languages are incredibly complex and nuanced. When they're lost, it's not just words that disappear, it's a whole way of understanding the world. Those languages carry their history, their stories, their connection to the land.
So those revitalization efforts are about more than just preserving words. They're about saving a whole worldview.
Exactly. And the Apache are getting really creative with these efforts. They're using everything from immersion schools to, believe it or not, digital apps to try and re-engage younger generations with their languages.
That's like tradition meets technology.
Exactly. They're realizing they need to adapt their methods to reach those younger audiences. So assimilation and language loss are two major hurdles. But there's more.
Okay, what else are they dealing with?
Well, like many communities, they're also facing all the impacts of modernization, globalization, economic disparities, and, well, the challenges of keeping their traditions alive in a world that's changing so rapidly.
It's a constant balancing act, isn't it? Holding on to their heritage while adapting to modern life.
You nailed it. It's about finding ways to bridge that gap between tradition and modernity.
Okay, I feel like there's a but coming. There must be some positive developments too, right?
Absolutely. Despite all these challenges, there's a lot of hope for the future of Apache cultural heritage. And a lot of it comes down to, well, their own efforts.
So they're not just sitting back. They're taking charge of their future.
Exactly. They're determined to preserve their culture, and they're finding some incredibly creative ways to do it.
Give me some examples. I need some optimism here.
Well, there's a growing movement among young Apache to reclaim their heritage.
That's great.
They're engaging with those traditional practices, learning their languages, and using social media to connect and raise awareness.
It's like they're breathing new life into those ancient traditions.
They are. And it's not just happening within their communities. There's a growing awareness and appreciation for indigenous cultures worldwide, which is creating more opportunities for collaboration and support.
So it's a two-way street. The Apache are working hard to preserve their culture, and the world is becoming more receptive to it.
Precisely. And that's a really positive trend.
Okay, I'm feeling a bit more hopeful now.
Yeah.
Any other reasons for optimism?
Definitely. Remember their adaptability.
Yes.
It's still one of their greatest strengths. They're finding ways to integrate their traditions into modern contexts. Think about contemporary art with traditional motifs, music that blends old and new styles, or even using their ecological knowledge to help with modern conservation efforts.
Wow. They're showing the world that their culture isn't stuck in the past. It's alive and evolving.
Exactly, and that's inspiring.
Okay, so despite those challenges, the future of Apache cultural heritage seems promising. It sounds like it's going to be a collaborative effort, both within their communities and with the wider world.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that we all have a role to play in honoring and supporting the diversity of cultures that make our world so rich.
Well said. So it seems we've covered a lot of ground today. We've journeyed through Apache history, explored their social structures, delved into their spirituality, and even gotten a glimpse into the future. What a deep dive it's been.
It really has. And before we wrap up completely, there's one more key aspect of their future I think we should highlight.
Whoa, what's that?
Sharing their culture with the world.
Right, we talked about that a bit earlier.
Yeah.
But how are they actively engaging in this kind of cultural exchange?
Oh, in some really meaningful ways. For instance, they've been collaborating with artists, filmmakers, writers from all sorts of backgrounds.
Oh, cool.
To create works that really showcase Apache history, their perspectives, contemporary issues they face.
So they're inviting us into their world, helping us see things from their point of view.
Exactly. And these collaborations have led to some amazing documentaries, art exhibitions, written works, you name it. They've gotten a lot of attention, and rightfully so. It's such a powerful way to foster understanding, challenge those stereotypes, and just build appreciation for their culture.
Yeah, sharing those stories is so important. Are there other examples of this cultural exchange happening?
Definitely. Think about their traditional medicine and wellness practices.
Okay.
They've shared their knowledge of herbal remedies and healing techniques with, non-indigenous practitioners. It's led to a much greater understanding of and respect for the value of those traditions.
So their ancient wisdom is actually helping shape modern healthcare approaches. That's incredible.
It really is. It shows how important it is to respect and honor indigenous knowledge systems.
Yeah,
There's just so much we can learn from their connection to nature and their holistic approach to well-being.
absolutely. And speaking of nature, their environmental stewardship is something we touched on before. Can you talk a little more about how they're sharing their knowledge in that area?
Of course. Their relationship with the land is, well, deeply spiritual. They've always understood the importance of balance, living in harmony with nature. So they're sharing that traditional ecological knowledge, collaborating with environmental organizations and conservationists
Oh, cool.
to find, sustainable solutions for everyone for a healthier planet.
It's like their ancient wisdom is helping us create modern conservation approaches.
Exactly. It's another great example of tradition and modernity working together.
I had to say, I'm completely in awe of the Apache people. They face so many challenges, yet they've kept their identity, adapted to a changing world, and are now sharing their culture with the world.
It's a truly remarkable story. And it's not over. They're still fighting for their rights, protecting their land, and inspiring others with their strength.
So as we wrap up this incredible deep dive into Apache culture, what's the biggest takeaway you want our listeners to have? What can we all learn from their experience?
I think the key is this. Culture isn't something fragile that needs to be locked away. It's dynamic, resilient, and always evolving. The Apache story shows us we can honor the past and embrace the future, keep traditions alive while adapting to a changing world.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about finding that balance.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that preserving culture is an ongoing journey, not a final destination. And we all have a part to play in that journey, whether it's learning about different cultures, supporting indigenous communities, or just appreciating all the different traditions that make our world so vibrant.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. It's been an incredible journey of discovery.
It has.
And if you want to keep exploring, be sure to check out The Warrior's Way, Book 8, and all those fantastic online resources we mentioned.
There's a whole world of knowledge out there waiting for you.
So until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep celebrating all those incredible cultures that make our world so extraordinary.
See you on our next deep dive.
Bye, everyone.